Once again, thank you for being here. The United Campus Ministries here at FGCU is a somewhat diverse group, but we are united in serving and caring for the students at FGCU. I'd ask right now those who are part of the campus ministries here, either students or actually the campus ministers, if they would please stand up to be recognized. I can see a few are a little shy about it, but thank you so much, and please connect with them in one form or another. Now, with the university reorganizing itself to increase student success, I wanted to highlight a little research that has been done on the relationship between religion, spirituality, and student achievement in college. One study that I've read through in recent years and through some of my research was a study based at the University of California on spiritual life of college students that started in 2003 and went through 2010 as quite a comprehensive study. And you can see some of the areas of that research that were done through those 7-8 years, surveying over 200,000 students across 236 institutions in the United States. Now, what they found is that 80% of the college students during those studies say they still believed in God, and about the same number had occasionally or frequently attended religious services in the year prior to when they were surveyed. Now, that comports with the reality that our world, even today, is 83% composed of people who are religious, identifying with one of the major religious traditions. Now, this study didn't just find out where they were at, but they found out the relationship between religiosity, spirituality, and success in college. In fact, the students who were engaged in religious practices during their college years reported that they had a greater satisfaction with their social life on campus, a more positive evaluation of interaction with other students, a higher overall satisfaction rating of their college experience, and a higher GPA. Now, growth in spirituality, if they were engaged in it and active in it during the college years, it increased their aspirations for advanced degrees, it increased their psychological well-being, their leadership self-concept, their self-perceived ability to get along with persons from other races and cultures, and their commitment to promoting racial understanding. So to conclude, all our campus ministries here are here to serve both the students and the entire university, and we hope that we prosper together. We are ready to partner with you in many ways. In fact, we probably, as campus ministers, only have scratched the surface on ways that we could help serve or promote student success, and we'd love to be involved in it in any way and open to any way in serving with you. And on that note, we are thankful that there are many in the faculty and staff that are dedicated beyond the academics to the student life in general. And I'm glad to introduce now Professor Eric Dent from the Lutgert College of Business here at FGCU. He'll be sharing his personal story of faith and service. Thank you, Eric, for coming to speak with us.
Well, the first time I think I remember thinking seriously about this question of the existence of God is when I was in 3rd grade. I grew up in Boca Raton, Florida, and if you tell people you thought seriously about the existence of God in 3rd grade, a lot of them will think you're strange. And maybe you all think I'm strange too, but maybe not, because I think if you're one of those who live the life of the mind, perhaps you've gravitated to academia as I have. But really, 3rd grade was about the time that I started this pursuit of the question, the scientific pursuit of whether or not God exists. And so when it came to my ideology, and remember, our ideology is what we want to be true, not necessarily what is true. But when it came to my ideology, I was pretty ambivalent about this question of God. On the one hand, who would not endorse the idea of there being a loving being that wants a personal relationship with each of us and ultimately will restore heaven on earth, right? You can't go wrong with that idea. On the other hand, even as a third grader, I wasn't so convinced that I liked the idea of there being a God. And as I got to be an adult, in fact, I thought, well, when did they open up the job position of God, and why didn't I get to apply for it? Because, I think I've got some pretty good ideas about how to fix the world's problems. And maybe if I can't be the God of the world, can't I at least be my own God? Can't I be the God of my life? So even as a third grader and today as a grown person, I'm still kind of ambivalent about this question of whether or not I like the idea that there might be a God. But ultimately, as a teenager, what I did was to force the ideological part of me to yield to the evidence. And throughout my teenage and college years, as I studied extensively and learned more and more about the research that provides overwhelming evidence for the lordship of Jesus Christ, I decided I needed to bow to that evidence and make him my Savior. And I was able to experience that love that I mentioned on the previous slide. My wife Amy is here today. The greatest love I've ever experienced on earth is with her. We've been married for 31 years. But once you get touched and accept the love of God, it's on a whole nother scale, a whole nother scope. So the rest of that story would be the topic of another day. So let me turn now to my profession and tell you a little bit about that. So after growing up in Boca Raton, I went to college in Atlanta. I went to Emory University and left there with a master's degree in computer science. And I went to work for IBM. I actually spent the first half of my career in the private sector. And after, when I got into my 30s, I decided to go back to college and to work on a Ph.D. And I was trying to figure out what I should pursue a degree in. And I ultimately decided to go to a business school because I really felt then, and I even think more so today, that corporations are the biggest levers for change in the world today. If you went back a couple hundred years, it was probably in many countries the church. Later than that, in many countries, it was probably government. But today, the biggest lever for societal change, I think, is the corporation. And those societal changes and what we think and how we act are far more driven by what Apple and Coke and Walmart and Facebook do than by any other entity in the world. So I really decided to try to impact those corporations through my work, and I ended up in a business school at George Washington University where I majored in organizational behavior. And so in the business school, a lot of people think business schools are filled with number crunchers. And there's no doubt that is part of what we do in the business school. I'm in the management department here, and the management department has the largest number of majors on our campus. And it's really quite an interdisciplinary degree. So probably some of the other colleagues in my department wouldn't describe themselves this way. But for me, I'm pretty much about 60% philosopher, 30% psychologist, and about 10% what I call academic mutt. And I use that term because I think by not growing up in my career in academia, I didn't really take on the very discipline-specific focus to problems that academia has kind of been criticized for us being in those stovepipes. So I felt fortunate that I've just kind of researched whatever I happened to be interested in at the time, and that allowed me to have publications in a wide range of fields that are listed up there on the slides. At times I wanted to study history, then some science, then maybe executive coaching, and then what I'd like to talk about next is workplace spirituality. So in the field of management, The largest association is a group called the Academy of Management. And management is a very large discipline. In many campuses, it has the most majors. Nationwide and worldwide, it's a huge enterprise, if you will. And the Academy of Management, our mainstream association, they recognize about 25 subfields in management. And those would include my own main field of organizational behavior, strategic management, social issues in management, and 20-some others. And something quite dramatic happened in the year 2000. At that time, the Academy of Management recognized a new subfield, and that's called management, spirituality, and religion. And I believe it's the case that 3 of the faculty here on our campus were the signatories on the founding documents of the creation of MSR. None of us were at Florida Gulf Coast at the time. We were all at different places. But in addition to me, Dr. Matthew Sheep is here in the room, and you may know Dr. Sandy Kawanui would be the 3rd one who was involved in that. But the creation of MSR was really a pivotal moment because what that meant was that mainstream academia had now sanctioned, or to use a religious term, they had now blessed the teaching, the research, and the discussion of management, spirituality, and religion. So you may wonder, what sort of work happens when you are in the field of management, spirituality, and religion. And one area is that people focus and try to study and teach workplace spirituality, or another term that's more in vogue these days is spirituality at work. So I did one study that I'll tell you more about in just a moment, but we discovered there that there are definitions all over the map for something like workplace spirituality. It's in that category of concepts where I know it when I see it, but it's hard to define, it's hard to quantify. But this is one definition that the field has somewhat coalesced around. So workplace spirituality is a framework of organizational values evidenced in the culture that promotes employees' experience of transcendence through the work process, facilitating their sense of being connected to others in a way that provides feelings of completeness and joy. So in the paper that I just alluded to, cited there at the bottom, 2 colleagues and I took a look at sort of how was this field developing. Of course, it had been underway long before 2000 when it was blessed by the Academy of Management, but we took a look at what kind of studies were being published, what kind of topics were coming up, what definitions were in use. And what we discovered was that definitions were kind of all over the map. Some of them were directly contradictory to each other. And as a psychologist, I will say that to me, it's very important that we use terms precisely, so that we shouldn't use one word if there's already another word that's perfectly useful in that situation. So my own definition of spirituality, which I have not published, includes these 3 components that you see up there. Number 1, it needs to be something transcendent. That's part of most definitions where we're talking about something that goes beyond our material existence. And then secondly, I use the term connectedness specifically rather than connection. And you saw in that previous definition the idea of connected, but kind of connected to your coworkers. I think that this connectedness is much broader than that in some ways each of us in this room is deeply connected to a Chinese peasant who's sleeping right now, but in a few hours will wake up and work her fields. I think we've only begun to scratch the surface about what that connectedness might mean. Of course, we're connected to that transcendent being. We're connected to our earth in several ways. So I think that's a piece of it. And then sacredness, I think, is also an important component if we're really going to use the term spirituality. So sacred just means holy or consecrated. And when we consecrate something, all we do is we give it special meaning. So we consecrate time, for example. We have said this day of the year we're going to call Thanksgiving. and it's going to have a special meaning different from all the other days of the year. For many people, they consecrate and make sacred a Sabbath day. So whatever day of the week that may be, they say this week, this day of the week, we give special meaning to. It's different than the other 6 days of the week. We also make sacred places. For many people, Mecca is a sacred place. For many people, synagogues are special places. So we could have two buildings right next door to each other on the street. This one's not a synagogue, this one is. We give special meaning. We make sacred the one that is. We also consecrate and make sacred some people. Even in the secular age we live in today, if we were eating in the cafeteria tomorrow and someone sat next to us and she was wearing a nun's habit, we would probably clean up our language around her, and we would probably otherwise show her some deference. So for me, scientifically, I think this word spirituality gets thrown around way too much, and it needs to be used for only what it describes, and at least this would be my start to the territory that I think is separate for spirituality when we talk about it in the workplace. So my academic field has now entirely blessed the teaching, the research, and hallway discussions of management, spirituality, and religion. So let's talk about workplaces. So spirituality at work is that first acronym, perfectly fine workplace topic. So is religion. So how do we know that this is? Here in the United States, we have things like the First Amendment, and then we've had some clarifications on the First Amendment. In 1993, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed, signed by President Clinton, actually introduced into the House by then Congressman Chuck Schumer, introduced in the Senate, passed the House unanimously, introduced in the Senate by Ted Kennedy, where it passed on a 97-3 vote. And basically what that legislation says is that the federal government must recognize the most liberal, the most generous possible interpretations of what religious expression means. And the only time that they can limit that expression is if there's a compelling state interest. So what does that mean? So an example might be that we do have a federal organization called Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So they produce federal guidelines, federal laws about safety in the workplace. So if your religious expression was such that you needed to wear flowing garments or maybe that nun's habit, and you were operating machinery and that those garments could get caught up in that machinery, then there is a compelling state interest to keep you and coworkers safe by not allowing you to have that particular expression in that particular role in your job. And then in 1997, President Clinton issued guidelines on religious exercise and religious expression in the federal workplace. And let me read you a sentence from that. What these guidelines say is that executive agencies shall permit personal religious expression by federal employees to the greatest extent possible. Now, that, of course, was directed to the 2 million or so federal employees that we have. But it's also been the case that those guidelines have been adopted by most private employers, most nonprofit employers, most state government employers, most municipal and other employers. So generally, these guidelines apply at most of the workplaces in the United States. So what does this mean? They give some very specific examples in those guidelines. They say that in your desk at work, you're allowed to have a Quran sitting on your desk. You're allowed to have a copy of the Bible sitting on your desk. If your employer allows you to personalize your workspace at all, maybe you've got a little cubicle with something you can pin something up in. If you're allowed to personalize that, then you can express your religion in that way. They cannot restrict how you would personalize your particular space. With your clothing, you can wear a pin. If your employer requires you wear a uniform, you must wear a uniform. But if they allow any kind of personal individuation in what you wear, then you can express your religion through what you wear. So I think a really good analogy is sports. So if you're allowed to talk about sports in your office, you're allowed to talk about sports in the hallway when you're on the clock, so to speak. If you're allowed to wear a pin supporting your sports team or a shirt for your sports team or have a poster for your sports team up in your office, anywhere sports is allowed, religious expression is allowed. So a lot of times people wonder about the topic of proselytizing. That's kind of a bugaboo, right? That word almost sends shivers up some people's spines. Well, a lot of people don't realize this, but these guidelines specifically mention proselytizing and specifically identify proselytizing as protected speech. Now, they also say that you cannot harass other employees. So the very first time, if you're Buddhist and you explain that to somebody else, the very first time you do so, that's perfectly protected speech. But if they ask you not to do it any further, then you need to comply with that and not harass people. So it occurred to me, my analogy with sports is perfect because I need to write up some of my coworkers who continue to harass me because they keep telling me their sports team is better than my sports team. And I've told them it's not true, but they keep persisting in that belief. But I think that's a good example of the analogy with sports, I think works perfectly. But maybe we allow more harassment in the sports discussion area. And then President Trump affirmed these same guidelines that had dated back to 1993. He did that in 2017. So let me return to academia for just a moment. In that article that I mentioned earlier, we were doing a meta-analysis of everything that had been published up until that point in time. And one of the things that we observed was that most of the articles published up until that point in time had been more ideological than empirical. In other words, they were not evidence-based. And I think the field, even in 2018, still suffers from having not enough evidence-based studies. But we were struck by the fact that more than half of the articles published made a separation, made a distinction between spirituality on the one hand and religion on the other hand, which is interesting because for billions of people in the world, in fact, Muslims in particular make absolutely no separation. To them, spirituality and religion are essentially one and the same. But more than half of the authors wrote articles saying that they're different. And not only did they say they were different, but they said spirituality is good and religion is bad. So spirituality is about compassion and harmony and generosity. And religion, you see the list there, religion is divisive. It's more concerned with perpetuation than humanity. It's authoritarian. It requires unconscious obedience. It's outward and anchored in formal rites and scriptures. It's concerned with faith and the claims of one faith tradition. It's connected with dogma, and it has no place in the workplace. Now, even someone like the Dalai Lama has actually endorsed this dichotomy. The Dalai Lama says spirituality, great, compassion, harmony, peace, religion, bad, authoritarian, divisive, dogma. But if you start to look at it for just a second, we have this actual technical term in many research fields called face validity. Face validity means if you think about it for more than about a minute. So with all due respect to the Dalai Lama, as John had a similar statistic just a few minutes ago, at least 84% of the world's population affiliates with some organized religion. And unless your world and national travels have been different from mine, 84% of the people I've encountered in the world are not dogmatic, they're not unconsciously obedient, they're not authoritarian. So it really doesn't pass the smell test even. But then if you get into truer, deeper levels of validity, very similar to what John was describing about student success, this subject has been studied for decades. It's been studied all over the world, and the subject is what kind of impact does religious practice have on outcomes? And any outcome that you can think of that we would consider to be positive in our country, in our world, religious people, on average, are higher on that outcome. So, I loved your list about student success. It's also true, the more religious you are, the likelier to be wealthy you are. The more religious you are, the more educated you're likely to be. The more religious you are, the longer your life expectancy. The more religious you are, the better health that you experience. The more religious you are, you'll report even higher sexual satisfaction. The more religious you are, you'll report higher levels of mental well-being. So the research for decades now has strongly shown that there is a substantial impact, that religious is a very good thing. All of those outcomes, longevity, wealth, health, all of those things are outcomes that society really wants to promote. So we know that religious affiliation, religious discussion helps increase each of those outcomes. Here's just a few examples of such studies. So in one case, they followed people for 8.5 years, and Christians dropped dead less often during the 8.5 years than people who were not Christians. Muslim Kuwaiti undergraduate students were healthier and enjoyed greater subjective well-being the more religious that they were. In Ghana, Christians have a higher income level and higher levels of education than people who are not Christian. So let me just conclude with one final word on proselytizing. Essentially, both in the workplace, in the field of study, we've endorsed that teaching, discussion, research, all of that is very appropriate on the subjects of spirituality and religion as the context is appropriate. When I moved to North Carolina in 2003, and then when I moved to Fort Myers here in 2016, I was really struck by how heavily people proselytized me. They told me, here's the neighborhood you really ought to live in. Here's the schools you really ought to send your children to. Here are the restaurants that you really need to eat at. Here's the club that you really need to join. And I ended up publishing this one-page article about that experience, about how maybe it's an American phenomenon. I don't know. I won't speak for any other country in this context. But it seems to me that Americans, when we experience some goodness in our life, we want to share that goodness with other people, and we want them to partake of that same goodness. So we go out of our way to proselytize people about any of these good experiences that we've had. Now, I've also had numerous people proselytize me and tell me that I should be on the South Beach diet, that I should be on the Atkins diet, that I should be on the caveman diet. Now, since my wife's here, I'll have to admit, I do eat like a caveman, but I'm not on the caveman diet. So I concluded that article with a statement that I'll read to you now. Are we really so thin-skinned, fragile, and impressionable in one realm of life that we can't hear about someone's religious beliefs, but we can hear about their beliefs about sports, shopping, restaurants, and child rearing? I'm not afraid. Tell me your religious beliefs, but please don't tell me how much weight I need to lose and will lose if I follow your diet. So scientific research has shown that religion and spirituality are incredibly important topics. So important, they need to be researched, they need to be taught, they need to be discussed in any context where that's appropriate. And that's exactly what everyone in this room as scholars and educators should do when we have an appropriate opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dent. We really appreciate everything that you've said, and I agree there is so much that we can learn from each other and have open conversations about all of these things. We are so thankful that you are here. And I believe Kerry Eastridge is around. He can help with this. He's the one who organized this again this year, and we thank him for that. He's part of Impact Christian Ministry. I do want to say a thank you as well to Dr. John Bruner and Maria Koenig. The two of them have been such a support to all the campus ministries, and they coordinate and organize as much as they can organize us. They do, and we just find such great support here at FGCU for the United Campus Ministries and all that we are doing, and thank you so much for their help. And we want to thank everyone here as well for attending. So, Carrie, we have